seconds for coming, and sorry for those who missed my talk yesterday. It was, the flight was too late and there was a traffic jam, so I simply couldn't come here in time. Today I will talk about networks and the evolutionary aspects of complex systems if you are perceiving as a network. My group, this link group, is a multidisciplinary group in the Semmelweis University in Budapest, Hungary, which is a medical university. So we use our knowledge of complex systems for understanding the cellular function and behavior, but also, as you will see later on at the end of the lecture, or second half of the lecture, we are thinking about the development, adaptation of complex systems in terms of evolution and in terms of short-term adaptation as well. First, this will be 4 parts in the lecture. Very first question, why do we like networks? What is the usefulness of the network approach? A few minutes on that. Then I will talk about modular evolution and some of the aspects what we had experimented in the laboratory with cellular networks. And then the last segment will be about changes of network rigidity and flexibility, and I will propose it as a general model of adaptation. So this will be the parts of the lecture. So how do we perceive networks? Why do we love to play with them? The major reason that we understand that this approach, when you treat a complex system, that you define the parts of the complex system and you gather a knowledge about the connections of these parts, so this is how it makes a network, has several properties which are pretty much general. Regardless if you examine networks from the biology, so protein structures, for example, cellular structures, brains, neural systems, or you examine networks of the social sphere, so your own networks regarding your friends, acquaintanceships, as nodes and your relationship to them as links or edges of the network, or engineered networks, which is the World Wide Web or other power nets, for example. All these networks have pretty similarly these properties, so they are small worlds, which means that they are very well connected. Even distant nodes can be reached as an average with a very few steps in the network. They do have hubs, which means that nodes which have a much larger number of connection degree as the average of the network. That's what is called scale-free degree distribution. And they do have a nested hierarchy, which means that usually the structure is hierarchical, and usually these networks are forming modules. Modules are dense groups of networks, like protein structures, for example, friendship circles in society, and so on. And my talk will concentrate quite much on these modules later on in the second half. Now, the generality of these network properties actually offers to us scientists 2 things, many things, but 2 things that I would like to point out today. The one is that you may use this property as a judgment of the importance of your finding. It is usually very difficult to judge how important your finding is. You do have a feeling about that, but usually it's the next generation which gives you credit for it or not, when you are already dead. I mean, this is not, science is difficult as a profession. However, in this approach, you may have a sense of the generality of your idea, because if it is valid to various networks in different areas of science, equally, or you can apply it, then it might be a more important idea, or it might be a more important finding, whether it's valid only for one of them. Obviously, peculiarities, so specialties of certain networks are also very important, but my group is pursuing ideas which are pretty much general, so we are happy if we find one of them. Now, the even more important one, which we like a lot, it is a kind of innovation transfer across scientific disciplines. I mentioned that my group is pretty much multidisciplinary, which we use in the network I mean, using the networks as an abstraction of a complex system to transfer our original problem from an area to a different one. I'm just giving you this example, and I will give you one more example in the next slide. That if you are talking about protein structures and you're talking about them as networks, when amino acids are the nodes, and the distance, physical distance, 3D in the 3D structure of the amino acids is the edge of the network with a weight, then you may instantly understand something whether this system is rigid or flexible. You even have information on that, whether the protein structure is rigid or flexible. However, when you start to think about other types of networks, whether this cell, like a cancerous cell, a malignantly transformed cell, is more rigid or more flexible in the sense of networks than a normal cell, then, well, the question is a nice question, but you don't have an idea about the answer. Or whether my friendship circle is more rigid now as it was 10 years ago, that's again a good question, or more flexible, but it's not very easy to give an answer. So this is how you may transfer your ideas to a different context, and you may look for the answers in this different context when you have to use different sentences, when you have to use a different conceptual network of the problem, and therefore, what we enjoy a lot, sometimes solutions, novel solutions come to your mind just because of the associations in the novel kind of conceptualization of that particular problem. I'm just giving you an example. This was a review paper in Nature almost 2 years ago. And the review paper was about the early warning signals for critical transitions. Now, the authors were cautious in selecting the title or formulating the title, because in fact they were talking about phase transitions, so very abrupt, very dramatic changes in the state space of a complex system. But they were very wise not to call it a phase transition, because from the physics point of view, and especially from the mathematics point of view, these transitions are not really phase transitions. These are a bit smeared phase transitions. However, what was very interesting, that they compared 3 complex systems: ecosystems, markets, and climate, and they pointed out similar behavior of these 3 very different complex systems right before a later change, which was considered or which was classified as a critical transition. Like in the ecosystem, a massive dying phenomenon is a critical transition of the ecosystem from a state to a very different one. In the market, a market crash, and in climate, we unfortunately now survive or experience a quite big change. Now, what was very interesting, that there were 3 signs which they listed as common signs of all the 3 systems preceding the critical transition, or warning the experimenters or the system participants that a critical transition may come. And these 3 signs were interrelated, but could be separately formulated. One of them was a slower recovery from perturbations, meaning that if you change the system by an input or by any other means, then if the system was far from a critical transition, then it was returning to the original state with a certain speed. If it was closer to a critical transition, then it was returning slowly, more slowly. That was pretty general in all the 3 systems. A related phenomenon was that there was an increased self-similarity of behavior, mathematically also it could be observed, if the system was closer to a critical transition as compared to a system which was far from a critical transition. Now lastly, I mean, this is related to the first 2, that once an extreme behavior occurred in the system, it was more extreme, or more times it was very extreme as the system was approaching the critical transition, because the critical transition itself is a very extreme behavior, but under normal kind of regime, normal conditions, far from a critical transition, there were not so extreme behaviors. Now when I was reading this paper, one of the topics that we pursue in my laboratory in a medical school, it is aging. It was instantly coming to my mind that a person who is getting old, really old, grandfather, great-grandfather, is behaving quite similarly to this. I mean, slower recovery from perturbations, an increased self-similarity, everyday routine, and once the poor old guy is lost, then he or she is really lost. So, I mean, extremes are really getting extremes. So, actually, aging can be perceived as an early warning of a critical transition. And now I think everyone figured out what is critical transition. It is a critical, I mean, network-wise, it is really a critical transition. I mean, death is a sudden decomposition of the networks, what have been characterizing, I mean, the percolation is all of a sudden lost when you die from the brain and from the cells as well after a while. But this is a good part as well. So you may think about the other side of the coin. Okay, if that is a phenomenon, how you can prevent it, how you can delay it, how you can delay critical transition. And all these systems are actually telling you many, more probably many, but I'm pointing out one, which is particularly important for me, method or way to delay a critical transition, and that is having nodes, having elements of the system, of the complex system, which have, by themselves, less predictable behavior than the rest of the system, or than the average, than the usual behavior. Now, in ecosystems, omnivores, so these animals which are eating ourselves, everything, are less predictable, because if something has been consumed already, then that omnivore animals can switch to another food. So they have no real preferences from this point of view. I mean, really bound, tied preferences. Top predators are from the similar kind of category, because the top predator can eat whatever she or he wants to eat, and that can also be switched to a novel type of kind of food if the other one has been exhausted. Now, market gurus are not really the guys who are panicking. They are the persons who have a second mind. I mean, they may cause panic, but they are not go for panic. So their behavior is not really the same as the behavior of the crowd, and this can be very profitable quite many times. And stem cells from our own body are not only behaving differently than other cells, being able to differentiate to any type of cells actually what they want or what the body wants, but also recent research proved quite much that aging, biological aging, the speed of biological aging can be regulated or is a function of the wellness of the stem cells of the particular person. So if the particular person has his or her stem cells in a good shape, then she or he might expect a longer lifetime or a more healthier kind of aging phenomenon as compared to a person whose stem cells are in a bad shape. So they cannot be differentiated, they are not there, they are not that flexible, and so on. We have to learn a lot from this, but these are interesting signs. Now, if you... please.
Before you go to a different topic, does it fit in with the order from noise principle that by creating variation in the system you actually stabilize it?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And actually...
I have lots of ideas about it, we should discuss that later.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, actually, it is valid what you told to all these three systems, and it's great.
Another question about these elements. Is it true that they are less reactive in the sense of responding in their behavior is a derivation of responsiveness and not of something which comes as if independent from
to be honest, I mean, numerically I can't answer to your question, so I don't know whether they are less reactive or not. But I wouldn't point out this particular property as a discriminating property of them. because I think they are very much reactive, but they are not copying their behavior. So they are not reactive in the sense that they are going for with the crowd, but they are reactive in the sense that they think, I will just show a picture to illustrate it. They are figuring out novel reactions for the situation. Now, your question is right, because sometimes not to react, that is a difference, while all the others are reacting. So if I would shout that there is fire, and you would believe me, then you would run to the door.
Yeah,
now, if someone is not running, that's a difference. So that can be a discriminatory kind of feature. So yeah, you're right. Now, if you see this very same behavior from the network point of view, then you can discriminate 3 different types of network behavior. There are 2 here. The third is coming in a minute to the figure. That's the most important one. The first one is the problem solver. A problem solver is having a specialized behavior to solve a certain problem, whatever problem it is. Make a lecture, something. Problem distributor is like a professor. We have a joke about professors in my university that if you are an assistant professor, then you know everything. If you are an associate professor, then you know how to look after things in the library, World Wide Web, whatever. And if you are a professor, then you only know a single thing where the assistant professors and the associate professors are. This is your knowledge. In fact, this is not true, but this characterizes quite well this kind of problem distributor behavior, that I know how to distribute the problem. I also know how to persuade people to solve the problem, but I don't care that much about solving the problem by myself. So that's an extreme thing, obviously. I mean, we do all type of behaviors.
But you are interpreting the nodes here as agents.
Yeah, I am interpreting the nodes here as agents. That's the best way to do that, because persons can be what is kind of behavior. Now, the most important one from the current story's point of view is the third one, is this kind of creative node, and this creative node is differing from the other 2 by at least 2 aspects. The one is that it's unpredictable as a behavior, but from the network point of view, it's even more important that it is more dynamic than the others. It is practically randomly, almost randomly, it's not random, closer to random than the others, sampling the network, sampling the kind of knowledge or behavior of the nodes in the network. So what is actually happening, that this guy, who is a problem solver, has a very constant position in the network here. That guy, who is a problem distributor, has a pretty constant position here, but knowing about many other persons, because most of the time this guy is a hub. This guy has a lot of connections. However, these creative nodes are jumping all around the network, and this is, we call them in the group creative nodes, because this behavior is similar to a highly creative person who gets bored very soon and therefore changes environment to get some new information. We had a mathematician in Hungary, Pál Erdős, and Pál Erdős was very well known to change his location each second week, actually. And when I was talking to László Lovász, who is a contemporary, very good mathematician of my country, Hungary, he told that if you wanted to tie or to maintain the attention of Pál Erdős for more than 5 minutes, then you had to be a very good mathematician. So that was a kind of very big discriminatory kind of level. Now, Pál Erdős is, I think, a typical character of this kind of creative node, who gets simply bored and then goes away and goes to a different location to find something more interesting. But in this way, these nodes after a while, have a knowledge about the particular properties of distant nodes in the network. So if something of a new situation arises to the whole community, so to the whole network, to the whole complex system, then these guys may not know the solution, because this is a new, it hasn't been, no one has specialized to solve this problem. These guys cannot distribute the problem because there is no one to be distributed at or to. But the combination of various elements of existing knowledge in a novel way which can be performed by these creative nodes may help. So this is, I think, an interesting phenomenon which is worth pursuing. Now, what is very interesting that you can identify these creative positions at various levels of complexity in proteins, in protein structures. Creative amino acids are actually at the active centers of proteins. Here, the mobility is not big. Actually, we have very little mobility as compared to a social system, for example, because these amino acids pretty much always have the same amino acids as neighbors, because the protein structure cannot change that much. I mean, that's denaturation then, if that is changing that much. We do have disordered proteins, and the department above us is working with those disordered proteins. So there are exceptions, but that's not the general kind of behavior at the protein level. Now, at the cellular level, protein-protein interaction networks are more mobile. Then proteins can change, and there are these moonlighting proteins, for example, which have been described by Peter Tompa. And those proteins are changing their location, so they are pretty much, can be classified as these creative elements or creative nodes. Creative cells are these kind of stem cells and many other cells which are migrating in our body and changing the behavior according to the environment. And our brain is obviously a very good example when there are existing connections, but the active segment of those connections is very dynamic. So that's the level that the dynamics may come into picture. And the society is very mobile. So as we go from less complex to more complex systems, the mobility increases. This is just the take-home message I would like to get. Now, my second topic is about a story, what we got in the laboratory, examining protein-protein interaction networks, and then I will expand it a little bit to show that it may be more general than the actual system. But this is just a background, and that's why the background is so ugly, background slide to show you the desperate life of a system biologist, who does not have proper data, because we never have proper data if we are examining cells or proteins or others. This is how we tried to make it sure, more or less, that the final result is robust. So it comes out, if you change, if it comes out indifferently, whether you change the incoming data, the networks what you examine, there are various protein interaction networks. All of them are yeast protein interaction networks. If you give various weights to the links, if you calculate the final link weight in various ways, then you examine two states. The point was in this particular experiment or simulation to compare the protein-protein interaction network of a resting yeast cell, so a dividing yeast cell which is proliferating vigorously, and to a yeast cell which was stressed by many types of stresses actually: heat shock, osmotic shock, starvation, manifold, cold shock, pressure shock, water shock. So I mean there were at least 7 types of shocks, actually 13 stress conditions in one and 6 stress conditions in the other data set. And all what we knew was the mRNA changes of the system. We did not have a direct knowledge on the protein level changes, and we did not have a direct knowledge on the changes of the protein-protein interaction network structure. So this was our bad fate. Now the idea was that we analyzed the same protein-protein interaction network, so kind of a basic protein-protein interaction network, but we changed the weights of the protein-protein interactions according to the quantity of the two proteins which made the interaction. So the logic was, if both proteins are abundant, there is a high level of the proteins, then the possibility of their interaction is pretty high. If none of them is abundant, so there are very few proteins in the cell from both, then the possibility of the interaction is pretty low. So this is how we tried to assess the situation.
So your link weight was a kind of a co-activation or co-occurrence?
More co-occurrence than co-active, because we didn't know too much about the activation, but we presumed that if both proteins are present, then the chance, if they can associate with each other at all, so we do have data on that, then the chance that in the system they are associating indeed, that's high. So this was the basic thing. And we did a lot of type of variation in the data and the calculations, and all our preliminary kind of results were not robust, except one, or actually two, and I will show you these two, which were constantly got back at a high significance. Now, we analyzed the modularity of this system, what means, or what I mean, how you can understand it, that the groups of the network, of the protein-protein interaction network, in fact, in a protein-protein interaction network, groups are protein complexes. So this is how you may rationalize this. But in the networks, in other types of networks, there are groups. This particular network, which I show you as an example, is a network of the network scientists. So here nodes are people, network scientists, and links are co-authorships in various publications. So this is how this particular network was constructed. And what we did, and there are two steps actually, or maybe three steps, but two is important in this method. First, we constructed a local, we call it influence zones, of all nodes or edges of the network, in this particular case, nodes. Which means that in this particular network, all scientists, any of the network scientists, had a kind of influence zone, and it was defined by certain, if you are interested, I have a figure on that, it was defined by a certain kind of very simplistic manner. There are many ways how you may define a kind of influence zone. One of them is, for example, that density is very important in networks if you would like to form groups. Therefore, I am increasing my influence zone until the density of the edges of the links in this zone is starting to decrease. When it starts to decrease, then I stop. So this is a pretty clear definition. You can make an algorithm and you can calculate it. So these are the types of ideas.
I'm not sure what you mean by density in this case.
Density is the number of edges per nodes. So you have like two more nodes incorporated in this island. Let's see if how many edges are between us. If these nodes have been connected with each other and both are connected with me, because I was the starting node, then the density is still pretty high. Let's have one more node. If that node is connected with each of us, then the density will increase. If that node will be connected with only two of us, then the density is the same. And if that node is connected with only one of us, then that will not be included to the island, because then the density would decrease. So this is pretty simple. There are more difficult conceptualizations of this. If you're interested, I can give you the link. Actually, the link is here. It's link group HU, my group, and that's the modularization segment. Now, what is very interesting, or what is the essence of this method? So we constructed these influence zones to each of the nodes. 3 are shown here, but in principle there are this 260 network scientists. And then we summed it up, a simple summation, which means that on the vertical scale you see the sum. Which means that if the sum is high, so this guy, who is actually a famous network scientist, that means that he was part of many people's influence zone. So he is a central figure in this network because many persons were incorporating him on their own network influence zone. These guys, I mean somewhere here for example, is not that central because it is a part of his own influence zone and maybe one more, but not many. So this shows you actually this summation, a kind of general influence on the network, or a general influence of the network on you personally. Now, what was very interesting that once you arrive to this picture, then the hills are actually the communities, and these hills of this three-dimensional kind of visualization, and the hills are overlapping. So this is a pretty large overlap. The nodes are participating in many modules. So we apply this method.
So the height is the general inference. Or
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
would that be kind of similar to a page rank phenomenon?
Yes, it is similar to a page rank, but the page rank is applying kind of biased random walks. So it is exploring more or less the neighborhood. Well, the extent of the neighborhood can be expanded, obviously. But here you are actually summing up a lot of random walk type starting, because I mean this is a kind of random walk. It can be constructed like that. Yeah. So it is. This is a kind of summed up page rank type of thing. So it is having more information actually than the page rank. You need more time, computational time to figure it out, and therefore page rank is more efficient. But this is more giving you a better, more detailed picture.
I would like to see the elegance because I'm not convinced. I think that page rank is pretty general.
I don't have a face-to-face comparison. So yeah. Using this method, but not only this one, we use other methods and they also show the same thing. What was the take-home message actually? That in a stressed yeast cells, nodes belong to less modules, and modules have less contacts with other modules. Which means that you can formulate the same two statements in two different ways. That most of the groups, were having a denser structure after stress than before stress. Which also meant that the groups were dissociating from each other.
There was also overlap between communities.
Yes. And actually, I mean, this is a common knowledge, because if you are surviving a crisis in society, then the first kind of reflex is that let's get closer. I mean, let's help each other in the small group, not in the kind of big society. And therefore, I mean, the society's integrity as such, and in the large groups, integrity can suffer, as we see. So modules are becoming more separated from each other in stress and disease example. Now what was...
But you use the term modules, but I don't know, would you rather call them clusters?
Yeah, you may call them clusters, communities, yeah.
The module normally has pretty clear boundaries, while a cluster is something that, where the boundaries to some degree flexible.
Yeah, it's difficult how, I mean, different people use it differently, but you're right, clusters can, clusters is we made a currently preliminary inquiry on telephone call networks, and we compared the structure of these telephone call networks under situations when everything was okay, as compared to a kind of event, which in this particular case was a bombing, so a terrorist event in one of the European countries. Now, first you see, and this was published by László Borovási and colleagues, that obviously the intensity, phone call intensity went up tremendously if there was a bombing event, because everyone tried to call, or they were called by people, whether you are alive, whether you escaped, or whatever, what happened. Now, what was very interesting that under normal conditions, the modules were pretty diffuse, which means people called a lot of type of acquaintances, distant acquaintances, family members, many people, with a distribution, obviously. But they become very condensed at a stressful period, obviously, because in crisis we call our mother and not a distant friend, so, or spouse, or children, or, I mean, the close family, or very good friends, best friends, perhaps. So, I mean, this is again pretty much obvious, but this you do see in the network structure as well.
What is the time scale, more or less?
Oops, sorry. The timescale, this bombing event was, I mean, the peak after the bombing event was 3 hours approximately, so this might be 5 hours, I think. Sorry.
Okay, so, because I was seeing the drop,
yeah.
So I was thinking maybe it fits with what you told at the beginning, that you have different behavior just before an event.
That's right.
But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah,
It
yeah.
seems a
yeah.
bit short.
It's a good.
But you can't really anticipate the bombing, so...
Yeah, that's why I would have been a reminder.
That's right. Yeah.
Otherwise you would have...
Yes, that's
Yeah, yeah, most probably. I haven't. I don't recall, but I think you're right. It was late afternoon. Yeah, I think yeah. Now the other point which came out from this protein structures or protein interaction network study was the importance of bridges. Bridges between the modules or clusters, which and it turned out that, I mean, these are the bridges of the heat shock yeast cell, and these are the bridges of the unstressed yeast cell, and this is a quality of the bridges, I mean, on this scale. So the higher the number, the best bridge was that particular node between two communities, between two clusters in the structure. So what you actually see, that there are some bridges which are persistent, which are always having a very high quality bridging function between various clusters. There are some bridges which are decreased in heat shock, so they are high in non-shocked cells and lower, much lower in heat shocked cells. And there are many bridges actually which are high in heat shock, but they were not so high. They were sometimes pretty low in non-shocked cells. So, I mean, the take-home message is that first, cell is maintaining bridges from between distant modules, even in stress. So it's very important not to lose the integrity of the whole cell. I mean, because the cell will die otherwise. So this is one thing which can be learned actually even in societies. The second thing is that the cell is constructing novel bridges. So it is important to find novel connections between groups in stress, because that may give you some novel solutions. I mean, these are proteins which are pretty important in cell survival. So if a cell survival protein is having a central position in the network during the stress, I think it's not bad. It's a good sign of survival. Now the very last thing is just summarized in this small figure and the table below it. So if you think about two extreme complex systems, and one of them is rigid like this table, or this one, and the other one is very flexible like this cloth, then they behave differently if it comes to adaptation. The flexible system can adapt, so the possibility of adaptation is pretty high, because whatever happens in the neighborhood, that is reflected by the flexible system. However, the flexible system doesn't have a memory, so it cannot keep really the result of the adaptation. On the contrary, the rigid system may not adapt because it has a shape, but once it adapted, then it will preserve pretty much that particular situation or behavior, what is characteristic to it. So actually, a system which has both qualities, so both rigid and flexible at the same time, is the winner in this adaptation game, as I would say, because it can adapt, but it also may keep it. Now, even more importantly, if you are just flexible or just rigid or just a mix of the two, then you may not be successful. So actually the real success is to be able to change this property. If you need to adapt, if you need a kind of learning capacity, then you should go or shift from rigid to flexible, because this is the way how you can adapt to the environment. So this is a kind of exploration phase that is exploring the possibilities, that is more kind of free has more degrees of freedom. On the contrary, if you need to optimize your behavior, if you need to remember to that optimized behavior, then you have to change your kind of structure just the opposite way, to become more rigid from more flexible. Now, what is very interesting in biological systems, and I will show you some examples, that a biological system may have cycles of this, actually. So going to be more flexible and then back to more rigid and then again more flexible and rigid. So it's a very important property of complex systems if they can regulate this.
It reminds me of the learning constant in neural networks. If your learning constant is high, you learn quickly, you're very flexible, but you also forget quickly what you learned before.
Yeah, actually, absolutely.
And I think that the main principle is if your environment is variable, if it changes quickly, then you should also be very flexible and learn quickly. If your environment is stable, then you should better remember long time.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's useful if you can change this learning constant or this flexibility depending on how variable your environment is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's absolutely right. And I'm just showing you a very different example first about this kind of flexibility and rigidity from a game theoretical example. Now these are spatial games, simple social dilemma games like Prisoner's Dilemma game or Chicken game or Hold Dog game or dilemma games, when only the neighbors in the network can play the game with each other. So this is why it's a spatial game. It's not a kind of mean field approximation. What is a general knowledge in the field that the outcome of this game, here the agents can either cooperate or defect. So this is a very simple system. You have two types of behavior only around. Well, there are more complex systems, but we examine this one. The outcome, how much the whole system is cooperating or how much the whole system is defecting, is very much dependent on the structure of the network. So this is a general finding. This is for like 10 years by now. Now what was very interesting in these studies, what we did a few years ago, that if you combine two types of behavior, where one of the behavior is to learn, to remember the outcome of the previous rounds of the game, and the other one is a random noise which you add to it, then the combination of these two types of behavior is giving you a high level of cooperation, which is not usual in the system because cooperation is difficult to achieve, and it will become independent from the network structure. So actually, even here in this very simple system, those agents which have combined these two types of behavior, so they were remembering the outcome of the previous rounds of the game and utilizing it in the strategy update as a strategy update rule, but also had an element of creativity, so an element of independent behavior of this learning or copying type of mechanism. These were the agents which could maintain the cooperation high and which could be independent from the rest of the network structure. So this is just an example from a very different field. Now this is another example, also a different field. In human metabolism, physicians identified two basic types of human metabolism. One of them is they call small phenotype, which is a thrifty metabolism, which means that here the enzyme levels are set in a way that all the energy, all the food is utilized, practically all. The food is utilized what you consumed. So the metabolism is very efficient in this way. This is typical to people, or animals as well, I mean, this is not only who usually starved and therefore got used to the fact that they have to utilize the food 100% or very efficiently, because otherwise, I mean, they die. The other type of metabolism is, they call it large phenotype. This is an overspending type of metabolism, not so efficient, not efficient at all actually. This is typical to people or animals who have eaten a lot. And therefore they need a less efficiency, because otherwise they would die from energy, I mean surplus. So, I mean, it's difficult. Now this is actually what makes diabetes so prevalent if a society is changing from a poor state to a rich state, because people got accustomed to the poor state and it needs 3 generations to change. So, I mean, as an average. So it is very stable. It is usually very stable. So I mean, there are plenty of situations when your grandfather was starving or your father was not starving, eating less, but you are eating a lot, and you haven't accustomed to that. You haven't changed your metabolism. You couldn't change your metabolism to that 100%, and therefore you still utilize the food as your grandfather or grandmother did, but you have much more, and therefore, or you eat much more, and therefore.
What I understand is that what you call the flexible, the overspending would be correlated with lots of muscle mass, because muscles require a lot of energy.
Most probably.
On the other hand, the people with diabetes, instead of muscle mass, they produce a lot of fat.
Yeah. I think if you like to get the essence, this can be
One of the advantages of muscles is that they store glycogen. So if you get a lot of calories, you have place to store the calories in a non-dangerous way. If you don't have muscles, you can't store it as glycogen. You have to store it as fat, which gives you all the negative effects.
Now, another approximation, sorry about these far-fetched approximations, but it's interesting.
Can you speak about the RMK strategies? Because
these RMK strategies are two strategies in ecosystems, and the R strategy is a strategy when you have a lot of offsprings. So you are actually exploring the ecosystem all around, so you are this proliferating type, so you are closer to this kind of large phenotype if you compare it to this kind of metabolic differences. Whereas the K strategy is concentrating to a certain location, doesn't have a lot of phenotype, but having a very optimized behavior to that particular location. This is very similar to what you said about changing environment, which is the R phenotype, or constant environment, which is the K
It's
phenotype.
not the same, I would say. There's a difference between specialists and generalists. I think the generalists are not the same as the R. It's, I mean, I have made it, I give a course on complexity and evolution where I use the 2 dimensions of selection, the R versus the K, but on the other hand, the generalist versus the specialist. And you can find cases that combine all 3. For example, rats are R and generalists, but humans are K and generalists. And then you have generalists that are, you have specialists that are K and specialists that are R. So those 2 strategies are orthogonal, I think.
Yeah, this is a rich picture, right? Well, the other example is a level higher, about the society kind of level. János Kornai is a famous Hungarian economist, and his basic kind of finding was a few decades ago that he identified socialism as a system, so as this system which was typical to the Eastern Bloc before, as a kind of shortage society, because shortage was a very special general property of that society. Shortage in labor, shortage in energy, shortage in food, shortage in raw materials, practically everything. Now, recently he went on and he identified capitalism as a surplus society. Well, it's not always there, but usually we do have a surplus of labor, as now, unfortunately. We do have, most of the time, a surplus of material, not exactly from everything by now on Earth, but usually. And it comes to one's mind that socialism was pretty close to a kind of rigid structure, and those who survived it, like myself, can testify that it was indeed very rigid, as compared to capitalism, which is much more flexible than that. So I am just tackling the idea that you may even classify societies on this scale to a certain extent. Now, my last example is about learning proper. There was a very interesting paper in PNAS a year ago when they analyzed fMRI images of brains, human brains, when undergoing a very simple learning task. Actually, it was not only one task, but 2 tasks consecutively. What was very interesting, that they defined the nodes of the brain network, which was the active regions of the brain actually, to be flexible if they were classified as part of one of the clusters on one occasion, and they left this cluster and they went and associated with a different cluster at a different occasion. Now this property they call flexibility. So this was their definition for flexibility. What was very interesting, that at session 1, the flexibility was much higher than at session 2, when they already, these subjects have already learned the behavior to a certain extent. So for that you would learn the behavior, actually the flexibility level was even having a predictive value. So if the flexibility was high, then the person could learn much better the task, whereas those people whose brain type of flexibility defined in this way was lower could learn the task much worse. I think this is very interesting thing about brain's behavior, and I just would like to compare it with a different paper which was published in Nature about 5 years ago about the learning of songs by male birds. Here, this is the complexity of the song on the vertical scale. So this is a not so complex song, this is a much more complex song, which means that usually we find this song, the more complex one, better, more beautiful. Actually, female birds do find it more beautiful, so this is why male birds do have mating possibilities. So that's a crucial thing in birds, because otherwise you will not achieve. Now, if you just concentrate on this figure on the top, you find it something very interesting happening. That this young boy, male bird, was going out and recognized that other birds could sing much better than him, so I have to learn. So he learned by the end of the day, and there was a night coming and he forgot practically everything what he learned the day before, and he started again. Now if you look at it to a longer term, like this is 15 days, this is 60 days, this is 70 days, so these are kind of 10-day scales, then you see that not always it went back to the very same position, so it was getting higher and higher and higher and higher, and finally it stabilized at a pretty high level. And what was very interesting, that if you prevented the birds to forget, then the birds could never get to the optimum. So actually you need to forget your first way of approach many times, and therefore you need to overcome to this kind of flexibility, rigidity cycles, because here it became more rigid in this sense, and then it became more flexible and rigid and flexible and rigid and flexible. So, I mean, this can be quite...
I just said about a similar phenomenon in physical training in sports, that people who do muscle building exercises, the muscles go up, but as they increase, the speed of increase diminishes. And they had done a group that was continuously training for 24 weeks, and when they were training 6 weeks on and then 3 weeks off, then 6 weeks on and 3 weeks off, and of course during the 3 weeks they lost a little bit. So but then when they started again, they went up much faster, and the end result was that they actually went as much as those that had been continuously training. The loss during the 3 weeks that they weren't training at all was compensated by the fact that they went up much quicker afterwards. And it reminds me a little bit of your...
Yeah, thank you.
But maybe it is just related to boredom. For example, if you keep doing one activity for a sustained period of time, you get bored.
Yeah, but the question is, why is there such thing like boredom? Boredom is probably a cognitive mechanism that tells you that it is not useful to do the same thing too many times. That diversity and exploration is good.
And that's why it's good to have 6 hours of sleep every night.
This is one reason. Yeah. So just a few closing remarks. About the same topics, you will see 3 figures with the same kind of structure. But here the extreme rigid system with the extreme flexible system, and I have some statements on them, very simple statements, just to summarize these ideas. Obviously the rigid system has few degrees of freedom, as compared to the flexible system, which has more degrees of freedom. And therefore, the rigid system has already stored a number of information, or a certain level of information, and the flexible system is capable of storing more information as compared to the rigid one, which may be closer to saturation of the possibilities which are there. Now, here the efficiency in a single task is higher in a rigid system as compared to the flexible system, which is inefficient. But the rigid system is inefficient in multiple task changing environment as compared to the flexible. Now, if you compare it to the old and young, rigid is more similar to the kind of old organism, which is already stored information, as compared to the flexible one, which is more similar, not completely obviously, to the younger one. Now, in a way, you would think that this is now closer to a non-creative and that is closer to a creative one, but I would like to kind of remind you that creativity is not always useful, and I will show you two examples when it's kind of not very useful, like this one, for example. I mean, certainly this is a creative form, but you can't really use that. And my favorite is the next example. It's a creative way to fill up your car, but, especially in crisis, but maybe not 100% useful. So in fact, you need a kind of balance between the optimization and exploration. So the appropriateness part of the quality, which is part of the old so-called behavior with the wisdom, and the originality, surprise part of the creativity, which is part of the young behavior, in quotation marks, obviously, because wise old people.
Creativity is often also conceptualized in terms of convergent and divergent thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and your left is more the convergent
Yes.
thinking, and your right is the divergent thinking. But what turns out is that the most creative people, let's say people like Darwin or Einstein, are the ones that are capable of both. They are capable of all kind of wild ideas, and then they are capable to drill down in all these wild ideas to find the one that's really the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is the ability to switch between the two modes that makes the real creativity, and that it's more in your balanced. Although it's more than balance. Balance would mean that you're kind of half the one, half the other. Well, in this case, it's the ability to switch from the one to the other at the right moment.
Yeah, yeah.
So how can you call that? Is there a word to say the ability to switch? I mean, it's a bit heavy.
Yeah, that's more than flexibility. That's
Yes, it's the yin-yang symbol.
yeah, but the yin yang doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not as dynamic. It's not the ability to shift back and forth between the rigid and the flexible
When you
approach.
move on the circle, one is diminishing and the other is extending, and when you
If
continue,
you circle
if you
around
turn
it, then
it,
it
yeah.
goes. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's the-
Okay, but that's a bit
Aha.
too periodic view, maybe. The point is that you can't predict when you will have to be divergent or flexible and when you have to be rigid or convergent.
That's the art part. of
That
it.
is the.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a meta flexibility,
Yeah.
kind of being able to adapt your strategy of adaptation.
So I think I have the take-home messages already. This is just showing that this is the three types of behaviors are actually changing. And the first take-home message is that network methods may identify influential nodes, which either lead or bridge network communities, or being a center of one or of many communities at the same time, and changes in network flexibility and rigidity, or system flexibility and rigidity, may provide a general mechanism of this system level adaptation. And these are just the people in my group. And,
And who are the creative and who are
no, the others are